Hey guys, this is Adrian from Blitz Kids, and today we're going to be going over pins. So in this short little video series, what I'm going to be going over is pins, forks, and I want to go over discovered attacks because I think those are the three main tactics that pop up in pretty much every single game. So with the pin, if you go on Lichess, it gives you a few things. And I know you can't see my whole screen, but I'll go ahead and read what it says. It says, an absolute pin is when a piece is pinned to its king and can't move without exposing its king to a check from an opposing piece on the same line or diagonal. Pin the knight to win it. And here we can see in this example, it gives us a nice red diagonal here to just give us the free move. All right, so it gives us the first one every single time. I noticed that. And we're going to be going through 8 of these examples. And so first what we're going to do is set up the pin. So one thing to take from this definition is that a line or a diagonal. What does this mean? This means that short range pieces cannot pin other pieces. For example, a king. A king cannot pin another piece per se, like via definition. So like maybe a king can stop a rook from moving because if it moves, then the king can take one of its pieces. But in that sense, of course, it's a pin. But in the vocabulary sense, a king, since it only has one square over, it can't pin it to something else. A pawn cannot pin, and a knight cannot pin either. So whenever we're talking about pins, we're talking about long range pieces. So that's bishops, rooks, and queens. All right, so in this example, we're going to be using the bishop. So I'll be highlighting in green to kind of show you the diagonals and how to break down each and every single position. So this first one is very easy. You just play bishop to d4, and this basically wins the free knight. Going back just one move. This knight cannot move because if we do, the bishop will then take the king. So as we can see, the knight here cannot move, and if it does, it's just illegal. So that's why it's calling this one an absolute pin, and there's different types of pins. There's the relative pin, which if a piece is pinned to anything other than a king is pretty much a relative pin, okay? And you'll notice something, that the small piece is always in front of the big piece, all right? This is the definition of a pin. If it's the opposite, then it's called a skewer. And so we'll be going over, that one maybe later on as well. I don't know. I haven't really decided yet if I want to go over the skewer because it's a little bit more rare. Pins pop up pretty much every single chess game. So here we have the knight in front of the king. The knight is worth 3 points. The king is worth the whole game. That's what I mean by small piece first, then big piece. So whatever piece is behind it has to be of higher value. Then that's a pin. All right, so here after king to g8, so I'll move forward, we have bishop takes e5. So that pretty much sets up the pin, and then you just win it. All right, so you'll go there, and that's game over. All right, so we had a nice little accomplishment sound. Now let's go to number 2. Number 2 is very simple. All we have to do is set up the pin. Now, in order to set up any pin, we have to look at the lines and the diagonals. So what we want to do is look at lines that go up and down, lines that go side to side, and lines that go on diagonals. Now, it really doesn't make sense to actually look at the up and down diagonals or the side by side because we do not have a rook or a queen. So if that is the case, then the only thing that we really should be looking at is diagonals, specifically dark square diagonals. And what you want to do with these dark square diagonals is look at the big piece and the small piece. You want to look at the small piece first and then the big piece. All right, so that's what you want to line them up. And we'll notice that the rook is on this diagonal with the king. All right, and that's a small piece in front of a big piece. So that means if we could get along this diagonal, we would actually probably this way would be better, right? If we could get along this diagonal, then we can win some material, and we can here. we can play bishop to a3, and the small piece is in front of the big piece. It's on the diagonal. We're using a long-range piece, and we know that this is called an absolute pin because the king is pinned, or the rook is pinned to the king rather than anything else. So here, bishop to a3, and now you just win the material, and game over. Now this one is going to be a little bit different. Off to the side, you can't see it on screen, but it says it's a relative pin, to set up a relative pin. So we're just looking at a few things. Now that we have a queen, a rook, a bishop, what we want to do is look at those files, those ranks, and those diagonals. So if we look at maybe files, right? One thing I'll notice is that this could be a pin. This is a relative pin, or a situational pin. A situational pin is it's literally not pinned to anything, but if they were to move off the file, rank, or diagonal, then you'll get mate. Okay, so like for instance, in this case, if I play a rook to e1, and let me just get these off. All right, so rook to e1, right, and the rook just moves. I don't want to trade, and plays rook h5. Now I would be able to play rook to e8. I don't win any material, but I get mate, which is even better. So whenever we're looking at pins, there's all kinds of different situations, setups where we can pin a piece to something. Okay, we can even pin it to a square, and the square would be e8. That what we're pinning it to. So that is a pin. I definitely see that. Maybe even queen e1 could be another one. But here, we need to look at the diagonals as well. So if we play like rook e1, I don't know how effective this pin would be because the rook could always just capture. And after the recapture, well, now it's my opponent's turn, and my opponent, let me highlight these in red, my opponent can actually just protect that square or make an escape square. There's multiple defenses to that move. So I really don't like that move because my opponent can defend against it. And if my opponent can defend against it, I never play hope chess. I always know that my opponent sees just as much as me, so I'm going to play the absolute best move. And if he can get out of it, then I'm not going to play it. It's just kind of like a silly little trap. It's like, ooh, what if he plays this? No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to play the best move in the position. So that is a situational pin. Now I start looking at diagonals, and I look at like my bishop moves, and we'll notice that these two are actually on the same diagonal, and they're on the a1 to h8 diagonal. So I'm really looking here. Can I get a piece there? And I can. I can get the bishop. So all I have to do is play bishop here. See, bishop to f4 looks like it pins the rook to the pawn, but that's not true because by definition, the rook isn't pinned at all. The rook can just move, and it's supposed to be flipped where the small piece is in front of the big piece, but here we see a big piece in front of the small piece. So that's not even a pin. But if we play bishop to c3, getting on this diagonal, we have the small piece in front of the big piece, which is the queen on g7. And we can see that it's very hard or very difficult to get out of this pin. The queen has no forcing moves that are good that can maybe counterattack or defend against this pin. So if we play just bishop to c3, we'll be playing a relative pin. And the key difference between a relative pin and an absolute pin is that the relative pin, again, is not with the king. All right, so we play bishop c3, and we would take the material after. All right, now we have to exploit the pin. We don't have to set it up. All we have to do is know what to do afterwards, because a pin is kind of a situation where you have to pile up. All right, so it's not just one move. It may be 2 or 3 moves where you're piling up, constantly piling up on this pin piece. And the reason why we want to pile up on this piece is because if the knight can't move in this situation against the king, right here, then why take it? Instead, I want to attack it with the least valuable piece on the board, and that is a pawn. Pawn is only worth 1 point. So that's exactly what we're going to do. So instead of playing rook takes e5 right away, we'll notice that the black pawn on f6 can recapture on e5. So instead, we're going to pile up more pressure and play f4. That way I'll have 2 attackers against 1 defender. So we'll have 1 and 2. And then we can capture it with the pawn rather than our rook. And that's what you really want to do whenever you're exploiting pins. You want to put pressure with the smallest value piece possible. So here we would play f4 and then just take, and notice how we're up a whole rook. Alright, now another one. I'm gonna go ahead and let you guys pause the video and see if you can first find the pin and then second exploit it. Alright, go ahead and pause your videos. Alright, very good. So if you got it, if you found the right answer, awesome job. If you didn't, it's okay. I'm gonna go ahead and show you, and then we have more puzzles that you can attempt. So first, I'm looking at diagonals, files, ranks. I'm looking at lines. Okay, I'm also looking at my long range pieces. Okay, this rook isn't active, so I automatically see that there's nothing to pin here. This rook isn't active, so there's automatically nothing to look at there. But I do have this queen bearing down the king, and we have maybe some on the queen side. And really my attention goes to this g7 pawn because it actually is pinned here. So the pinned piece is the pawn on g7. And basically what that means is the pawn can't go to h6 or f6. Now if it's not defending h6 or f6, that means this knight right here on f6 is hanging. And we just look at all of the other pieces, see which one could capture, and boom, there you go. Bishop takes f6. That's why it's very key, if you watch some of my other videos, to just identify all of the different captures. Having good board vision is one key way to minimize those blunders. So here we can play bishop takes f6, and here we would just win a piece. Alright, here is our next puzzle. Let's see if you guys can come up with the right answer here. So go ahead and pause your videos. Okay. It says, use your knowledge of pins to win a pawn. From Magnus Carlsen against Arkady. I'm not too sure how to say that. But you can get a winning position in one move. So here, we need to see the pin. Alright, so we identified files, ranks, and diagonals. We notice that this file is actually a pretty good pin, somewhat, because if this knight moves, then we can see that we can capture. The only problem with this is maybe our opponent does have knight to g7 as a defensive resource. But if knight g7, and we're going to use some calculation here, then rook takes rook on e8, then the rook will recapture on e8, then rook takes on e8, then this knight can capture on g5 because this rook is gone, it's off the board. So I'm not too sure if knight to g7 is a really good move. We win a pawn, and it should be a very interesting endgame. Maybe even this one will fall afterwards, the h4 pawn. So this might be a legit pin. This is a relative, situational, or is this a absolute pin? See if you can find out. Alright, so I gave you guys a moment. This is actually a relative pin. So our opponent does have the opportunity to move. Remember, absolute pin is whenever the pin is against the king. Alright, I'm also looking at my checks. I always want to look at my forcing moves, so let me go ahead and take away these arrows. And I like this check. It's interesting. If I play rook to d2, then our opponent cannot pin himself, let's say here, because then I would play rook takes rook, rook would recapture, and then I would exploit the pin along this file, the d file, with pawn to c3, winning the knight. So this isn't an option by my opponent. My opponent then could play, let's say, king here to c6. But then, how do I put pressure on? Well, there isn't a pin piece, so this is a bit tricky. Yeah, I don't really see a pin piece there. King can just move to c6. The reason why I didn't include king e7 is because then the king would put himself in a pin, and then maybe we could pile up on the pin, maybe play rook back, and then repeat moves. So I'm not too sure. Not too sure here. Another thing, kind of going back to this knight, because this knight is really the pin, the focal point. We can probably just play knight takes g5, and if rook takes g5, then let me highlight that one in red. Then rook takes g5, and if knight takes g5, then rook takes here. So then it would be a rook and pawn endgame. So I'm not too sure which one would be the best move. So I would really have to analyze this. Maybe both ways are actually okay, but I would probably want to trade off the rooks. Because based off of my theoretical knowledge, if I trade off all the rooks, then the knight with pawns on both sides of the board, the black knight would have a hard time creating a defensive against maybe two potentially passed pawns. And with the rook and pawn endgame, single rook, then you could possibly shift into a drawn rook and pawn endgame. So I really want to get my move order right here. So if knight takes g5, knight takes g5, then rook takes, rook takes, rook takes. So that's impossible. Knight takes g5, rook takes g5, then rook takes g5, knight takes g5, rook takes g5. Or bad calculation. If knight takes g5, knight takes g5, rook takes e8. If knight takes g5, rook takes g5, then rook takes g5, knight takes g5, rook takes e8, and that's a rook for a knight. So I do believe knight takes g5 would be the right answer. And that just wins a clean pawn. Yeah. And so he had to go into that knight g7 move that I was discussing earlier. That one was a very tricky one, I gotta say, but it was played by the world champion, so hey. Alright, so let's look at this one and see if you guys can come up with the right answer. Go ahead and pause your videos and see what you can come up with. Alright, so hopefully you guys found the right answer. Here we have the pin on the g8 king. So the small piece is in front of the big piece. This is called a absolute pin. That's right. So here the queen can capture on g6 because the pawn is no longer defending the g6 square. And after queen takes g6, if bishop g7, then we'll notice that the bishop is also bearing down on the king. So then queen takes g7, and that would be checkmate. Or if, let's say, let me take care of that arrow. After queen takes g6, king to h8, now we can still play bishop takes f6 mate, because then the bishop is undefended. So this is the correct answer. And they go with the first variation. Alright, this is the last puzzle. Alright, we definitely gone over some pretty tricky ones. Here in this position, there is a really cool maneuver that black can play. And I want you guys to pause your videos and again, try to find the pin first, see where it's at, and then try to exploit it. All right, very good. If you found it, if you didn't find it, it's okay. It's pretty tricky, and with a little bit of practice, you will get these rolling. So we'll notice that it's queen, rook, bishop versus queen, rook, knight. So 2, 5, 3, 2. That's 5. Okay, so it's technically equal in the position, but you'll notice that black's pieces are far more active. And these are all long range pieces, so we're going to be looking at files, diagonals. We're going to be looking at any form of a line. So right off the bat, I kind of see that we have a bishop bearing down here, but there's nothing there. Okay. I want to look at all my captures. This helps me identify where the target is. I really do like rook takes f2, kind of like a discovery attack, which we'll talk about later if you don't know. But this queen right here on g2 can capture on a8, and that's not going to be fun because this would then come with check, and I would be completely lost. Another thing is this is protected twice. I'm attacking twice, but it's defended twice. If we do the number count, I don't have enough material or resources to overtake that square. But I also want to look at my checks. And so rook takes h3 is probably one of the first captures that I want to calculate. So after rook takes h3, it looks like the queen can capture here on h3, but it can't because this queen is bearing down on the king if the queen were to capture. So the queen is actually pinned to the king. And yes, that is an absolute pin because the queen, although the most powerful piece on the board, the king is the most important piece on the board. So after rook takes h3, the king would then be forced to go to g1, which then we see the power of this bishop here, which allows our rook to go to g3 and then pin the queen to the king because the pawn on f2 is pinned to the king as well. So this is kind of a double whammy here. Rook takes h3, and you see the puzzle isn't finished because now we can go here to g3 and pin the queen to the king, and this pawn is pinned to the king by the bishop on c5. And that's why we want to activate those pieces. So rook takes g6 and pawn takes. And we are done. All right. Thank you guys. I will be uploading another video very soon about the forks, and then we'll go on to discovery attacks and possibly even skewers. All right, guys. Thanks.